She is 13, maybe 12. She doesn't speak, she isn't supposed to. Her hair is brushed, her tunic pure white. She has never left her father's home without permission, and never will again. Today, she is being led through a marble corridor by two men. One is her father, the other is the man who now owns her. He is in his 40s. He doesn't speak to her, he speaks about her. She's quiet, the father says proudly. Knows how to weave. Her blood came 2 months ago. They stop before a heavy wooden door. The man, her husband now, opens it. The father places a kiss on her forehead, and then hands her over. She steps inside. The door closes behind her. And just like that, she is gone. She will not leave that room for years. Not without permission, not without a veil, not unless it is to give birth or to die. Outside, men will debate freedom. They will invent democracy. They will write philosophy, sculpt gods, and map the stars. Inside, she will be forgotten. Her name will not be written in law. Her voice will not be heard in court. Her opinion will not be asked in marriage or medicine or motherhood. Her body will be claimed, her mind discarded, and none of it will be questioned. Because in ancient Athens, a woman wasn't a person, she was a function, a vessel, a silence passed from man to man. She had no name, no voice, no choices, and no escape. She was born female, and that was her first crime. If you enjoy watching and learning about history, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore history together from all around the world. The world remembers Athens as the birthplace of democracy, a shining city of marble, ideas, and the Enlightenment. But that memory is only half true, because the city that gave men the right to vote, to speak, to reason, gave women nothing. An Athenian woman had no citizenship, no vote, no court standing, no political identity. She wasn't just second class, she was legally invisible. She could not speak in assemblies, she could not attend debates, she could not challenge her husband in court, even if he beat her, raped her, abandoned her. She existed solely in the shadows of the oikos, the household, and within that household, she served one purpose: reproduction. From the moment she was born, the state and her family began preparing her womb. She was trained to be silent, to bleed at the right age, to marry early, and to produce sons. Athenian girls were typically married off by age 12 to 14, long before their bodies or minds had finished growing. Their husbands were often twice their age, sometimes more. These weren't love matches. They were property transactions, masked as piety and tradition. The girl's consent was never required. She was transferred from the authority of her father to the absolute control of her husband. He who gives his daughter in marriage, the Athenian law said, gives her body, her bloodline, her service, and her silence. Sex was not mutual, it was assumed, expected, legally sanctioned. There was no such thing as marital rape in Athens. A husband had full sexual rights to his wife, anytime, under any condition. If she refused, she could be beaten. If she complained, no one would listen. But wives weren't the only ones subjected to this. Athenian men were legally permitted to own and use female slaves, for labor, for breeding, for sex, and they did. The city was filled with concubines, courtesans, and domestic slaves. Most were taken from conquered lands or bought in the agora, the public slave market. Some were barely teenagers, many were children. The Athenian man had access to. It was a violation of him, his honor, his household, his reproductive line. The punishment for raping a woman wasn't about the woman's trauma, it was about damaging the man's property. In Athens, rape was a crime of trespassing, not of violence. To avoid this, wives were kept inside. Not for protection, but for preservation. Their sexual purity was essential, not for them, but for the legitimacy of their children. If a woman was suspected of infidelity, her children could be disinherited, erased from the bloodline, so they locked her away. Literally. The Athenian home was divided into male and female zones. The women's quarters, called the gynaikonitis, were deep inside the house, windowless, guarded, hidden. A wife couldn't leave without permission. She couldn't visit the agora. She couldn't eat with her husband's guests. She couldn't speak to strange men, or even show her face to them. Her body was too valuable, not as a person, but as a vessel for male continuity. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about the transfer of a womb from one man to another. A contract that began with bleeding and ended with childbirth. And when she could no longer give children, she could be discarded, returned to her father's house, replaced. If she died in childbirth, and many did, her name might not even be recorded, because she had fulfilled her role. She had served her function. To the Athenian state, one historian writes, a woman's worth began at her womb, and ended there too. This was not an accident, it was a system, built deliberately, legally enforced, culturally normalized. And behind the marble columns of democracy, behind the speeches and sculptures and golden myths of Athens, was a world of rooms with no doors, girls with no choice, women with no voice. From the outside, an Athenian home looked respectable. Clean white walls, simple architecture, courtyard, a place of family, tradition and order. But step past the threshold, and you'd find something else. A prison, not with chains, but with laws and silence. In ancient Athens, the home was a man's domain. He ruled it like a king, and his wife? She was his subject, legally, socially, completely. The Athenian husband was permitted, even expected, to discipline his wife. A slap, a strike, a locked room, a week without food. It wasn't abuse, it was maintenance. A necessary correction to preserve honor and control, and the law supported him. There were no legal protections for a woman inside marriage, no court to appeal to, no right to escape. If a girl disobeyed her father, he could punish her. If a wife displeased her husband, he could beat her. If she cried out, no one came. And if a man killed his wife in a fit of rage, he could claim defense of household honor and be acquitted. But women weren't just controlled by violence, they were controlled by space. Every Athenian house had a gynaikonitis, the women's quarters, a small set of rooms deep inside the home, no exterior doors, few windows, no access to the world outside. This wasn't for comfort, it was for containment. Girls were taught from childhood to stay inside, to avoid the sun, to hide from men, to speak only when spoken to. If a woman was seen on the street alone, people whispered. If she spoke too loudly, she was mocked. If she met a man's gaze, she was accused of shame. She could leave the house only for funerals or religious festivals, and even then, heavily veiled and escorted by male relatives. She could not walk in the agora, she could not shop, she could not gather with other women freely, she could not enter the gymnasium or theatre. Her world was a few dark rooms and a locked door. This isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A woman cut off from society has no voice. Oh allies, no power. She begins to believe that her cage is normal, that her pain is deserved, that her suffering is sacred, and so the silence continues. The legal system reinforced this. A woman could not testify in court, even on her own behalf. She could not bring charges, she could not defend herself. If her husband falsely accused her of adultery, she could be thrown out or even executed with no trial. If she was raped, she couldn't speak for herself in court. Her father or husband had to speak on her behalf, and if they chose not to, her pain went unpunished. She was not a person under the law. She was a possession, a liability, a shadow. Even the dowry system reflected this logic. When a girl was married, her father paid a dowry, money or property, to compensate the groom for taking her. If the marriage failed, the dowry was returned. The girl? She was sent home like damaged goods. This made divorce easier for men, harder for women. If a man no longer wanted his wife, he could send her away, take the dowry, keep the children, and move on. But a woman could not initiate divorce. She could not seek protection. She could not demand rights. She could only beg her male relatives, the same men who gave her away, to take her back. And if they refused, she stayed, trapped, beaten, alone. The walls of her home were not shelter. They were a sentence. And so the Athenian house became a machine of silence. It created obedient daughters, compliant wives, erased mothers. It trained women to hide, to submit, to disappear. This wasn't just a cultural norm, it was policy, practice, power, carved into daily life. And it worked. Because for centuries the voices of Athenian women went unheard. They didn't write the laws, they didn't build the temples, they didn't appear in the histories. They lived, they suffered, they died, all within rooms the world never saw. What happens to a mind when it is told not to exist? In ancient Athens, a woman's thoughts were not hers to develop, her voice was not hers to use, her curiosity was not hers to explore. From the moment she could walk, she was taught one thing: obedience. Girls were not sent to school, they were not taught to read history or philosophy, they were not encouraged to write, to ask, or to wonder. They were trained, like animals, for the roles they would play: wife, mother, weaver, womb. The most a girl might learn was how to count for managing household resources, how to sing hymns, and how to obey without question. While boys were taught rhetoric, logic, ethics, girls were taught silence, and so their minds were stunted not by nature, but by design. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Philosophers, the same ones who shaped Western thought, said it plainly. Aristotle wrote, "The female is a deformed male. She is more emotional, less rational, and less courageous." Plato, though more generous, still believed that a woman's soul was only valuable when it imitated male virtues: discipline, reason, hardness. To be feminine was to be weak, to be emotional was to be dangerous, to be curious was to be shamed. And society reflected that. An ideal woman was one who was never heard from. The more silent she was, the more virtuous she appeared. Her name was kept private, even in death. Tombstones often didn't bear a woman's name, only wife of or mother of. Public records used her father's or husband's name in place of her own. A woman without a man had no identity. Even her voice in public was considered offensive. She could not testify in court. She could not speak in assemblies. She could not stand in temples unless as a passive participant. A woman's testimony was legally invalid, even if she had witnessed a crime with her own eyes. She was not trustworthy, not rational, not a citizen. A woman's mouth, one male playwright wrote, was made to kiss, not speak. And so women learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, or to not have them at all, but the cruelty didn't stop there. It was cultural as well as legal. In Athenian drama and poetry, women were not portrayed as heroes. They were mad, jealous, deceptive, lustful. They were witches, murderers, curses, monsters in disguise. The tragedy of Medea, a woman who kills her children. The myth of Clytemnestra, who murders her husband. The wrath of Aphrodite, goddess of sex and ruin. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. Men wrote them to justify control, to teach fear, to prove that women, when free, were dangerous. And this message was everywhere. Even religious rituals, one of the only public roles women held, were carefully managed. Women could carry baskets, perform dances, sing hymns. But they could not lead. They could not speak doctrine. They could only serve as decorated tools of the male priesthood. They were symbols, never full people. What does that do to a person? What does it mean to live in a society that sees your mind as defective, your voice as pollution, your name as shameful? It breaks something, and that was the goal. Because a broken mind doesn't rebel. A silenced woman doesn't resist. A girl who learns to whisper never dares to scream. The most powerful men in Athens debated freedom daily, while their wives weren't even allowed to speak. This wasn't just patriarchy, it was erasure, an intentional generational stripping of identity, and its effects were devastating. No letters survive from Athenian women, no journals, no memoirs, no manifestos. They lived in the most documented civilization of the ancient world, and yet they left behind almost nothing, because their lives weren't considered worth writing down, their thoughts weren't saved, their pain wasn't remembered. They were not part of the conversation, because the conversation was about them, not with them. They were studied like beasts, managed like crops, feared like fire, and they learned to disappear. When you live in a world that views you as property, love becomes irrelevant, and marriage becomes a transaction. In ancient Athens, marriage wasn't about compatibility, it wasn't about desire, it wasn't even about stability, it was about control over bloodlines, property, and female bodies. Athenian law was obsessed with keeping wealth inside the family, and that meant one thing: marrying your own blood. It wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Fathers arranged marriages between uncles and nieces, between cousins, even between half-siblings, not for closeness, not for affection, but to keep land from slipping into the hands of outsiders. The oikos, the household, was the core economic and political unit. Every effort was made to consolidate power within it. Women were the vessels used to do so. They were married off young, often before puberty, and once married, their sexual value belonged to their husband, who might also be their uncle. There were no laws against incestuous marriage between close kin, as long as it served inheritance law. If a man died without a male heir, his daughter could be forcibly married to her nearest male relative to keep the estate in the family, even if she was already engaged, even if she was a child, even if the man was decades older. Her consent, irrelevant. The state didn't care if she loved him, or feared him, or bled every night from being too young to bear what was forced upon her. What mattered was this: the land stays in the name. This was known as the epikleros system, a law that legally tied a daughter's body to her father's estate. The daughter was not an heir. She was a conduit, a reproductive tool to produce a male who would inherit in her place. If no male heir was produced, the family name risked extinction, and that was considered a greater tragedy than any woman's suffering. So she was passed along, married to whoever could legally bind her womb to the property. Sometimes girls were taken from mourning into marriage. Imagine you are 12, your father dies, you have no brothers, and within days you are sent to marry your 40-year-old uncle, not because he loves you, but because you are attached to land. No questions, no protest, just more silence. In some cases, these marriages were never consummated until the girl reached puberty, but that decision depended entirely on the man. And in Athens, no one punished a husband for touching his wife, no matter her age. Historians debate how widespread these kin marriages were, but the legal structure made them common, especially among the elite, because the elite had the most to protect and the most daughters to trade. Even women who tried to resist had no legal power to refuse. To deny a marriage was to insult the oikos, to shame the family, to risk disinheritance or worse, permanent confinement. There are stories, scattered and fragmentary, of girls who refused, who screamed, who ran, but they didn't change the law, they simply vanished from the record. Because Athens had no room for rebellion, only obedience in the name of blood. A woman's family was her jailer, and her husband could be her own blood. This is the cruelty that hides beneath the marble, the brutal mechanism beneath the myth. It wasn't just that women were controlled by men, it was that they were controlled by the very men who raised them. A father trained her for silence, an uncle claimed her womb, a cousin bred her for heirs, a son inherited her shame. This wasn't an aberration, it was the system working exactly as intended. The Athenians didn't see this as abuse, they saw it as order. They called it purity, tradition, legacy. But for the women who lived it, it was a blood prison with no doors. She was born into debt, not because she owed anything, but because her existence came with a cost. In ancient Athens, to be born female meant to be born valued, not loved. A daughter wasn't nurtured for herself, she was prepared for transaction. From the moment she could walk, her worth was calculated, not by her intelligence, not by her strength, but by her dowry. The dowry was no tier gift, it was a price tag. It was the sum her father would pay a man to take her away, a deposit for her obedience, an insurance policy for her silence. Rich families bartered lavish dowries to secure high-status husbands. Poor families scraped together what they could or couldn't. And if they couldn't, the girl became unsellable. And when a daughter couldn't be married, she was sold another way. Some girls were offered to temples, not for spiritual salvation, but for ritual prostitution. Others were sold directly into brothels, public, legal, and profitable. The Athenian pawn, or prostitute, was part of everyday life, but almost always born from desperation. The marketplace, the agora, was where girls as young as 10 were auctioned. Some were foreign slaves. Others were native-born Athenians, sold by their fathers or trafficked by debtors. The most valued commodity, a virgin girl, considered untouched, sacred, and lucrative. She could be trained, groomed, branded as exclusive. A hetaera, an elite courtesan, could be educated and refined, but only to entertain the minds and bodies of elite men. Her survival depended entirely on pleasing her patrons. The state didn't just tolerate this system, it regulated it. Prostitution was legal, taxed, and controlled. Men could access multiple women, wives, slaves, courtesans, each with their own role. A wife for heirs, a slave for labor, a courtesan for conversation and sex, but all of them were possessions. All of them could be bought, traded, discarded. And what happened if a woman became pregnant? If she was a slave or concubine, the child belonged to the man. If she was unwanted, she could be exposed. Infant exposure was common in Athens. A father had the legal right to reject his own child. Female infants were abandoned far more often than males. They were left in the wilderness, in alleyways, on Mount I. Besides, some were taken by slave traders. Most died. Even daughters who survived infancy were constantly reminded they were economic liabilities. They could not inherit. They could not own property. They could not earn a living unless through their bodies. If a husband died, a widow returned to her father's house unless she had sons to cover her cost. And if a woman was divorced, she was often returned like damaged goods, dowry refunded, womb devalued. The father remained the legal guardian of the daughter, even after marriage, even after childbirth. She belonged first to him, then to another man, but never to herself. There are stories of girls begging not to be married, of women who tried to run, of mothers who wept as their daughters were sold. But the machine of Athens did not slow down. The family was an economic engine, and daughters were the fuel. In Athens, daughters weren't raised, they were priced. No one asked if she wanted to marry, no one asked if she wanted to live. She was weighed in silver, wrapped in silence, and sold in the name of honor. This wasn't an underground crime. It was policy. It was custom. It was the foundation of the world's first democracy, built on the backs of women who could not speak. Athens glorified the mind, but marketed the womb. It sculpted ideals, but sold girls. It debated justice, but auctioned innocence. And through it all, the daughters remained unseen, until now. Absolutely. This is grounded, documented historical truth, and you're right, these forgotten voices deserve to be heard. Here's the continuation. They called it the Golden Age, but for women, it was an age of silence, subjugation, and sanctioned pain. And at the core of it all were the thinkers, the great minds, the philosophers who shaped the foundations of Western civilization and wrote womanhood out of it. Let's begin with Socrates, the father of Western philosophy. He believed in asking questions, in doubting everything, except the structure of patriarchy. Socrates rarely spoke of women, and when he did, it was in metaphor. He used the female body to describe disorder, temptation, and chaos. Even in myth, the feminine represented danger. Pandora, the first woman, was a curse in a box. Then came Plato. He proposed that women could, in theory, achieve wisdom, but only by transcending their femininity. In his Republic, he suggested that elite women could be trained like men, but only if they abandoned motherhood, avoided marriage, and submitted to state control. A female philosopher in Plato's mind was valuable only when made masculine. Femininity itself, still viewed as irrational, weak, and unstable. And then, Aristotle, the most influential philosopher in Western history. The man whose ideas shaped Christian doctrine, Islamic scholarship, and centuries of legal systems. Aristotle wrote, plainly, the female is, as it were, a mutilated male. Woman is more compassionate and more easily moved to tears, more jealous, more quarrelsome, and more apt to scold and to strike. The male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The one rules, the other is ruled. This was not a passing opinion. This was a foundational principle in his biology, politics, and ethics. To Aristotle, women were biologically colder, incomplete, lacking the rational fire of men. Their primary function was reproduction, not thought. And these ideas stuck. They weren't just written, they were taught, passed down to Roman scholars, to church fathers, to Enlightenment thinkers, to legal codes and marriage doctrines and educational systems. The logic was clear. If women were naturally inferior, then male domination was natural law, and Athens enshrined this belief in every aspect of society, not just in politics or marriage, but in culture. Their tragedies portrayed women as liars and destroyers. Clytemnestra, who murders her husband in a bath. Medea, who kills her children to punish her husband. Antigone, punish. D for defying male law to honor a dead brother. These weren't warnings about individual women, they were allegories, cautionary tales about what happens when women step out of line. The message was reinforced through religion too. Goddesses like Athena, goddess of wisdom, were praised only because they rejected femininity. Athena was born from Zeus's head, not from a woman's womb. She remained a virgin. She sided with men in every myth. She was worshipped because she was the exception, a woman who behaved like a man. And then there was Euripides, a playwright who said, "There is no worse evil than a woman. Even the cleverest woman is inferior to the stupidest man." This wasn't just theatre, it was ideology. masquerading as entertainment, and it had real effects. Women believed they were less. They taught their daughters to be less. They passed down their own erasure as virtue. If a woman tried to learn, she was ridiculed. If she questioned, she was dangerous. If she resisted, she was mad. There are virtually no written works by Athenian women from this era, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were never allowed to say it. The philosophical world was closed to them. The schools, the libraries, the academies, all for men. And this exclusion wasn't accidental. It was defended, codified, justified. Even in thought, the narrator reminds us, she was bound, though her intellect declared unnatural by the very men who built the West. The tragedy is this. These same philosophers who built democracy, ethics, and science also built the cage for women's minds, and that cage lasted for centuries. Their ideas spread to Rome, to Christian doctrine, where Eve became the sinner and Mary the silent womb, to medieval Europe, where women were burned for knowing too much, to Victorian laws that barred women from voting or owning property, to modern textbooks where female genius is still the exception, never the rule. We cannot tell the story of Athens without telling the story of its silence, a silence authored by its greatest minds, and so. And until that silence is broken, history remains incomplete. Athens, the city of light, of knowledge, of democracy, of freedom, that's what we're taught. But beneath the marble, beneath the legends, beneath the laurel wreaths and statues, is a silence, and that silence is female. Because while Athenian men debated liberty, Athenian women lived in cages. They had no voice in the assembly, no power in the courts, no place in the marketplace, no freedom to move, speak, write, or choose. They were traded like goods, married to men they barely knew. Often men who had known them as girls, or even as kin, they were kept indoors. In the gynaikonitis, a section of the home built to isolate, to contain, to erase, their sex lives were controlled, their pregnancies monitored, their very bodies owned by men from birth to death. They were educated in obedience, taught to be invisible, punished for speaking, praised for silence. They were made to believe that virtue meant disappearing, that goodness meant surrender, that womanhood meant vanishing. And even when they suffered, when they bled, when they broke, their pain was not written, it was not remembered, it was not mourned. She wept alone, the narrator says, and no one came. Athens gave the world many things: philosophy, architecture, science, democracy. But it also gave the world a model of patriarchal perfection, a system so efficient, so brutal, so normalized that it became a blueprint for centuries. Rome copied it, the Church absorbed it, the Enlightenment refined it. Even today, echoes remain. The belief that women are too emotional for politics, too delicate for leadership, too sexual for freedom, too dangerous for truth. These ideas didn't fall from the sky. They were forged in Athens. And the irony, the very civilization that gave birth to the idea of liberty did so while erasing half its population. Athens is celebrated as the foundation of Western freedom, the narrator reflects. Yet half its people were never free. Women were not citizens, not partners, not equals. They were functions, breeders of heirs, vessels for male pride. Chalk outlines on the wall of history, and it didn't matter how smart they were, how brave, how full of dreams. There was no door, no exit, no rescue, just another generation of girls locked in the same rooms, saying the same prayers, bleeding on the same sheets, burying the same silence. They were taught to serve, to disappear, to die nameless, and most of them did, but not all. Because today, we speak of them. Today, we remember. Their names may be lost, but their pain is not. Their minds may have been silenced, but their stories still echo. They are the ghost in democracy's foundation, the shadow in the light, the truth behind the myth. She wove, she bled, she bore sons, but she was never seen. She was democracy's ghost. And now, we see her.